Sheriff's daughter slipped into his cabin. He couldn't resist. The night had not yet given up its grip when Daniel Crow stirred awake in his cabin. A single log burned low in the stove, throwing faint shadows across the rough wooden walls. Outside, the land stretched wide and endless, the kind of silence that pressed against a man's ears until he felt he might drown in it. He had lived with that silence for years. It suited him. No voices, no demands, just the moan of wind and the creak of old timber. Daniel sat up on the cot, shoulders heavy with the memory of another sleepless night. His hands, rough and scarred, reached for the tin cup on the small table. The water inside was cold, untouched from yesterday. He drank, not for thirst, but for routine. A man without habits could go mad out here. The cabin was his world, a cot, a table, a chair, the stove, nothing more. The less he owned, the less he could lose. That had been his rule since the war, since the fire, since everything he once cared for was turned to ash. But that morning, as the first thread of pale dawn slipped through the cracks of the shutter, he noticed something different. A shadow. Small. Moving. Daniel froze. The hairs on his neck rose. He reached for the rifle leaning by the wall, fingers wrapping around the worn wood. He listened. The silence broke with the faintest sound, the creak of a floorboard not pressed by his own weight. Then he saw her. She stood in the corner, half hidden, trembling in the faint light. A girl. No, not just a girl. He knew her face. He had seen it on the streets of town, carried high with pride beside the sheriff. It was his daughter, younger than 20, perhaps 17, though her eyes looked far older. Her dress was torn at the hem, dirt smudged across her cheek. She clutched her arms around herself as though trying to vanish into her own shadow. Daniel lowered too. He rifled slowly, though his pulse still hammered in his chest. "What are you doing here?" His voice cracked the silence, deep and worn. She didn't answer. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, her eyes darted toward the door, as if afraid it might burst open at any moment. Daniel took a step closer. The girl flinched, shrinking against the wall. It was then he noticed the bruise. Faint, purple, just beneath her left eye. His throat tightened. Outside, the wind whistled low through the pines. Inside, the cabin held its breath. She had slipped into his world of silence, carrying something unspeakable with her. Something broken. Something he could neither ignore nor easily accept. Daniel set the rifle back against the wall, though every nerve in him still urged caution. The girl hadn't moved. She stayed in the corner like a stray animal, her eyes fixed on the door, her breath shallow and uneven. He knew fear when he saw it. Not the kind that came from a startled noise or a rattlesnake underfoot. This was deeper. The kind that sat in the bones. The kind that didn't leave, even when the danger passed. "Sit," he muttered, pointing toward the chair. She shook her head quickly, clutching herself tighter. Her silence was louder than words. Daniel turned away, stoking the stove, though his mind churned with questions. Why here? Why him? Of all places to run, why would the sheriff's daughter slip into the cabin of a man half the town avoided? The answer came in fragments. The bruise beneath her eye, the way her dress was torn, the trembling that didn't stop. He thought of the sheriff, broad-shouldered and stern, a man who carried authority like a badge carved into his skin, a man who didn't take kindly to weakness, not in himself, not in others. Daniel's stomach turned. He remembered the smell of whiskey on his own father's breath, the crack of a belt in the dark, the way he and his brother had pressed themselves flat against the barn wall, hoping to vanish into the wood. He had left home at 16 with nothing but a knife in his boot, and he'd sworn never to go back. Now, staring at the girl, he saw his own past painted across her face. But helping her meant war. The sheriff wasn't a man to forgive. If his daughter was here, hiding, It meant something terrible. It meant the law itself could turn against Daniel. He already lived half outside of town's favor. One whisper, and they'd drag him from this cabin in chains. "Why here?" he asked finally. His voice was quieter, almost weary. Her lips parted. She shook her head, eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. Then she whispered, barely a breath, "Safe." The word lodged in Daniel's chest like a blade. Safe. She thought him safe, though he hadn't felt that way in decades. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he was no savior, that he had nothing to give. He poured water into the kettle, placed it on the stove, and sat down on the edge of his cot. His hands rubbed against each other, restless. He thought of sending her back, of walking her to the edge of town and leaving her where the sheriff would find her. It would be the simple choice. Clean. But he could already hear the sound it would make. The sound of boots on porch steps, a cry in the night, the slam of a door that never opened again. He couldn't bear it. Daniel looked at her again. She had moved closer without a sound, standing near the chair now, watching him with eyes too old for her years. She didn't ask, didn't beg. She only waited, as though she already knew his choice. He let out a long breath, the kind that came before a man took a step off a ledge he swore he'd never cross. "You can stay," he said. The kettle whistled softly, as if sealing the vow. The morning sun cut through the shutters in thin bars of light. Daniel poured the girl a tin cup of hot water, the closest thing to tea he had. She wrapped her fingers around it, though her hands shook so badly the steam swirled unsteady. He wanted answers. Boo, yet he knew better than to push. Words came slow when a soul had been wounded, so he waited. The cabin creaked with the weight of silence until, finally, she spoke. He said, "I belong to him." Daniel lifted his eyes. Her voice was thin, but it carried a truth that chilled the room. "Who?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. "My father," she whispered. "The sheriff." The name landed like a hammer. Daniel leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed pressed a heaviness into his chest. The sheriff, the very man who carried the law in his hands, had driven his own daughter to run barefoot into the night. She looked at him then, eyes red, face pale but steady. "If he finds me here, he'll kill you." Daniel's jaw clenched. He had lived long enough not to fear death, but this was different. This was a man who could twist truth into a noose, who could paint Daniel as the villain before the town even asked questions. And he had the power to make it stick. "Why tonight?" Daniel asked. Her gaze dropped to the floor. "He promised me to a man, a trader from the south, said it was duty, said it was the law of our home." She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the tin cup. "I couldn't breathe, so I left." Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a runaway girl. This was a storm. If the trader wanted her, he would come looking. And the sheriff, bound by his pride more than blood, would stop at nothing to reclaim her. Outside, a crow cawed, breaking the morning's fragile stillness. Daniel stood, walking to the window. From the cabin's high ground he could see the dirt road winding down to town. Empty for now, but not for long. Memories pressed in on him. He had once carried a boy out of a burning farmhouse in the war. The boy had begged him not to return him to his father, a captain who drank more than he fought. Daniel had taken the boy north, given him to kin. Days later, he had heard the captain had sworn vengeance. Men like that didn't forget. The sheriff was cut from the same cloth. Daniel turned back to her. "They'll come." She nodded, silent, as though she had known this all along. The threat wasn't just outside. It was inside too. She had brought danger into his cabin, into his solitude, and he had let her stay. A horse's distant whinny echoed across the valley. Daniel stiffened, every muscle tightening. He walked to the rifle, checked the chamber. His heart beat steady, not with fear, but with a grim acceptance. Time was short. He glanced at the girl, still huddled in his chair, clutching the tin cup as though it were a shield. He saw in her the same hollow look he once carried, the look of someone who had no one left to fight for them. Now, whether he liked it or not, he was that someone. The silence of the cabin had been broken, and the footsteps of trouble were already on their way. The day passed slow. Daniel moved about the cabin, tending to small chores, though his mind never strayed far from the girl seated by the stove. She barely spoke. She didn't need to. Her silence was a language he understood well. At noon, he set a pan over the fire and dropped in potatoes he had peeled with the edge of his knife. The smell filled the cabin. He slid a plate toward her, watching as she hesitated before lifting a piece to her mouth. She ate carefully, as though unused to someone feeding her. He didn't ask questions. He just shared the meal, the scrape of forks on tin plates louder than words could have been. When she finally looked up, their eyes met. She gave the smallest nod, a thank you without sound. Daniel returned it with the faintest tilt of his head. It was enough. Later, he stepped outside with his rifle. The valley stretched wide, grass bending under the wind. He raised the rifle, fired once at a distant stump. The shot cracked across the land. Inside, he knew she had flinched at the sound. He came back in, set the rifle on the table, and slid it toward at her. "Your turn." Her eyes widened. She shook her head quickly. He didn't press. Instead, he opened the chamber, showed her the empty rounds, the worn barrel, the trigger's weight. Slowly, gently, as though teaching a child to hold a bird without breaking it. Her hands trembled as she touched the wood, but he steadied them with his own. Together, they lifted the rifle. Together, they aimed at the window's square of light. For the first time, she almost smiled. Not a full smile, just the faint pull of lips that had forgotten how. Daniel let her set the rifle down. She sat straighter now, a little less curled into herself. As dusk bled across the sky, he took off his coat and hung it by the door. The firelight caught the pale scar across his forearm. A jagged line burned deep into the flesh. He noticed her eyes fix on it. "War," he muttered, though he rarely spoke of it. She nodded once, then slowly pulled back her sleeve. A scar of her own traced across her wrist, thin but cruel. Not from war, from something closer, sharper. Daniel said nothing. Neither did she. They didn't need to. The scars spoke enough. 2 lives marked by pain, 2 histories written on skin. As the night grew colder, he fetched another blanket, laying it over the chair where she sat curled. She watched him carefully, suspicion fading from her face, replaced by something softer. Trust was a fragile thing, but it had taken root here, in this small cabin on the edge of the world. Hours later, she dozed by the fire. Daniel sat awake in the chair, listening to her breathing. The storm of what was coming pressed heavy on his mind, but for a fleeting moment he allowed himself stillness, a rare peace. In that quiet, he realized something. She had brought life into his silence. A fragile, broken life, but one worth protecting. One worth breaking his own exile for. It felt almost like hope, and he hadn't felt that in years. The first sound was hooves, slow at first, then louder, pressing against the earth like drums of war. Daniel's eyes opened from a restless half-sleep. The fire in the stove had gone low, but the girl was still curled in the chair, her face soft in the orange glow. He rose quietly, reached for the rifle, and stepped to the window. Dust trailed behind 3 riders making their way up the valley road. Even from a distance, he recognized the man leading them. Broad shoulders, a dark coat. The sheriff. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had expected this moment, but expecting it didn't make it easier. He turned to the girl. She was awake now, her eyes wide, fixed on him. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. He gave a short nod. Stay quiet. By the time the horses stopped outside, the air in the cabin was thick with tension. The sheriff dismounted first, his boots crunching on gravel. 2 men followed. Deputies, armed, faces hard with loyalty or fear. A heavy fist struck the cabin door. "Crow!" the sheriff's voice thundered, sharp as a whip. "I know she's in there. Send her out, and we'll walk away clean." Daniel steadied the rifle in his hands. His heart was steady, his breathing slow. He thought of telling her to run out the back into the trees, but the men outside would be ready for that. He opened the door instead. The sheriff stood tall, his mustache bristling, his eyes burning with the fury of a man betrayed. "You're harboring my daughter. That's a crime against the law and against me." Daniel's gaze held his. "She's not property." The sheriff's jaw twitched. He stepped closer, boots heavy on the porch. "You think you can protect her from me? From the law?" Behind him, one deputy shifted nervously, but the other grinned, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Daniel raised the rifle, not at the sheriff, but just enough to make the message clear. The air between them grew thin. One wrong breath, and bullets would fly. Then the girl's voice broke through. "Father?" All eyes turned. She had stepped to the doorway, blanket still wrapped around, and her shoulders, face pale but steady. The sheriff's fury flickered into something else. Not softness, but fear. She raised her sleeve, exposing the scar on her wrist. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. "You did this." The deputies looked at each other. For a moment, silence pressed harder than the guns. The sheriff's face flushed, his mouth working, but no sound coming. The power he carried in town, the respect, the fear. It cracked under the weight of her truth. Daniel saw the moment. He stepped forward, rifle steady. "Leave," he said, voice low, sharp as broken glass. "Or the whole town hears what she's told me." The sheriff's nostrils flared. His pride demanded blood. But the deputies, men who had daughters of their own, shifted uneasily. One lowered his hand from his revolver. "Sir," he muttered, "maybe we walk away." The sheriff glared at him, then at Daniel, then at the girl. For a heartbeat, Daniel thought the man would draw. Damn the consequences. Instead, the sheriff spat into the dirt and turned back to his horse. "This isn't finished," he growled, mounting. The deputies followed, though their loyalty now hung by a thread. Daniel lowered the rifle only when the sound of hooves faded into the distance. His chest ached with the weight of what had just passed, the cost of defiance, the risk of death, the shadow of war now cast over them both. He looked at her. She was trembling, but she stood tall, eyes locked on the horizon, where her father had vanished. For the first time, Daniel realized he hadn't just chosen to protect her. He had chosen to defy the sheriff, a decision that could cost him everything. The cabin was silent again, but it was not the same silence Daniel had lived with for years. This silence was sharp, cut through with the memory of boots on his porch, the echo of her voice naming her father for what he was. Daniel set the Rico, flew back against the wall. His hands trembled faintly, though his face showed nothing. The girl stood in the doorway still, staring into the night where the riders had disappeared. The blanket slipped from her shoulders. Forgotten. "They'll be back," she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. He knew she was right. Men like the sheriff didn't walk away forever. They came back, harder, meaner, with more fire behind them. But for tonight, the danger had passed. He moved past her, stepping onto the porch. The valley lay quiet, the road empty, dust already settling where hooves had churned it. The moon hung low, pale and tired. He drew a long breath of cold air, then returned inside. The girl had sunk into the chair again, hands folded tight, head bowed. He watched her a moment. She looked so small against the rough wood, so fragile, as though a strong wind could scatter her. Yet she had stood up to him, to her father, with more courage than most men Daniel had fought beside in the war. He pulled another log from the stack and fed it to the stove. The fire cracked, light filling the room with warmth they both needed. Neither spoke. The quiet stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Of fear, of exhaustion, of unspoken gratitude. After a long while she looked up. Her eyes glistened in the firelight, but no tears fell. She didn't ask if he regretted it. She didn't ask if they were safe. She only said one word. "Why?" Daniel sank into the chair across from her. His body felt heavier than stone. He rubbed the scar on his arm, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost to himself. "Because I know what it's like to be left with no one." Her gaze held his. A faint shiver ran through her shoulders, but she nodded, as though the answer was enough. The night dragged on. Daniel dozed lightly, waking at every creak of the wind, every shift of the fire. The girl slept at last, her breathing steady, the blanket drawn back over her shoulders. By dawn, Daniel had made his choice. He couldn't stay here, waiting for the sheriff to return with more men, with more fury. The cabin that had kept him hidden all these years was no longer a refuge, it was a trap. When the sun broke over the ridge, Daniel saddled his horse. The girl watched from the doorway, her face pale with the weight of what she already knew. "We ride east," Daniel said simply. She nodded, clutching the bundle of her few things, a torn dress, a scrap of bread wrapped in cloth. She climbed onto the horse behind him, arms tightening around his waist. Daniel looked back once at the cabin. The place he had buried his past. The place he thought he would die alone. Then he turned away, urging the horse onto the road. The cabin shrank behind them, swallowed by trees and distance. Ahead lay only uncertainty. But also, perhaps, something more. They didn't speak. The hooves on the dirt road were enough. The silence between them had changed now. It was no longer hollow. It was shared. Weeks bled into months. The road east carried them through valleys and rivers, over ridges where the air was thin and sharp. They never stayed long in one place. Some nights they slept in barns, some under the open sky, the stars their only roof. Other nights, kind strangers offered them a floor by the fire. The sheriff never found them. Perhaps he searched. Perhaps his power weakened when whispers of his daughter's scars spread through town. Daniel never asked, never returned to learn. The past had lost its claim. The girl changed first. Her silence softened. She laughed once, faintly, when a rabbit stole bread from their pack. Daniel had nearly forgotten what laughter sounded like. She began to ride her own horse, her back straighter, her eyes clearer. She no longer curled herself into corners. She faced the world with quiet defiance, as though each sunrise was proof she had survived another night. Daniel changed too, though slower. He had spent years hollowed out, living like a ghost among walls of wood. Now each mile east pressed life back into him. He found himself listening for her voice, waiting for the sound of her footsteps when she walked ahead on the trail. She had dragged him from silence into something like living again. By the time spring warmed the land, they reached a small town on the edge of rolling fields. The locals didn't ask questions. Daniel traded labor for food, mended fences, lifted beams. The girl, no longer the sheriff's daughter in her own eyes, helped in kitchens, taught small children to read. In the evenings, they ate together by the fire of whatever room they were given. No grand speeches, no plans for the future. Just two souls sharing bread in peace. One night, she handed him a folded scrap of paper. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words were steady. "Thank you for not leaving me." Daniel read it once, then folded it carefully and slipped it inside his coat pocket. He carried it always after that, close to his heart. Years later, When the cabin and the sheriff were nothing but distant ghosts, Daniel would still wake at times in the middle of the night, listening for silence. And always there would be the sound of her steady breathing near him, a reminder that he was no longer alone. The world hadn't given them peace, but together they had carved a place where survival felt like something more. On a quiet evening, as dusk settled across the fields, Daniel looked out over the horizon, the girl beside him, her face lit by the last golden light. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. The wind moved through the grass, soft as a hymn, and in that sound, their story lived on, not in words, but in the silence they had filled together.